So yeah, I'm Carrigan. I'm part of Transition Partners. I'm a delivery consultant. So with I've been working with Scott Logic and Colin for a few months now. They're opening up an office in Leeds, and so we've been helping with the recruitment of that. But yeah, so Colin, he's the CTO at Scott Logic. So he's going to be chatting to you guys and discussing with you about open source and sustainability. So yeah, I think I'll leave it to you, Colin, to kick it off with the introductions.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me along, and thanks everyone for coming along and participating. So this is a new format for me, and it may be new for some of you as well. The idea is it's a bit of an open discussion. People who know me will know that I'm a bit of a talker, and I could talk for a long time about this subject. Please stop me from doing so. Regarding the topic itself, sustainability in open source, that's a big topic, and I don't intend to dive directly into that question. I think we need to gradually build towards it. So the rough structure I had for the discussion is quite simple, starting in with what does open source mean to you personally as individuals? What's your experience with open source on a day-to-day basis? Next, maybe talk about what the open source community looks like, because it's quite a diverse community. There are different types of open source projects. Then start to talk about once we've got an understanding of the community and your experiences within it, let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and specifically the sustainability challenges. And then finally, time permitting, we can fix it all by talking about the solutions if we're lucky. But in the interests of not being the only one talking, it would be great to hear a little bit more about each of you. So as a bit of an icebreaker, it would be great to just let me know your name, the company you work for, or what you're doing, or maybe even just your personal interest and why you're here, and then a little bit more about your relationship with open source. So I'll do the same. So I'm Colin Eberhardt. I work at a financial services software consultancy. My relationship with open source is a lot of the platforms we build are built on open source technology. It's a fact of life for us. But I also have quite a personal relationship with open source, in that in my spare time I contribute to quite a few open source projects and have created a number of my own. So that's me and my relationship with open source. To go next, RD, you've already spoken, so I'm sure you're more than happy to go next. So yeah, what's your name? Roughly speaking, what do you do, or what's your interest in this?
I have a very long biography, and it'll just bore people. I'm not here in an official capacity. I'm here for myself.
Cool.
So I was elected a member of the Apache Software Foundation in 2004 or something. I've done about over 20 years of open source, and I've seen the cycles come and go. So I'm just here to, because I've had the last 18 months have been really bad for me. So I'm just here to enjoy it and see what everybody else is doing. And I have a longer perspective than I suspect everybody else here, I would imagine.
I wonder why that might be.
Oh, it's not just because I'm old. I used to be a young punk, and what I did in the days of my reputed youth was open source and stuff like that.
Cool. So. Well, thanks for that intro. Does anyone want to volunteer to be next?
I'll go next.
Excellent, thank you.
Oh, I'm probably going to have some Wi-Fi troubles. Apologies. Yeah, Goodness telling you I'm unstable. So I'm not technically here officially either, because I actually work with Carrigan. I work to support. I support the company.
I think she's frozen.
Exactly.
Oh, I think she's frozen.
To support. I'm a PA by trade. That's been I spent down Linux code, and I am frozen.
On and off.
I think I could probably fill in a little bit, but for Jenny,
yep.
She does coding. She does quite a lot of coding in her spare time. She's done a lot of courses, I think with Manchester Codes, I think it was. Cool. So she is very interested. She's doing a project at the moment, which looks really interesting. She showed me a lot of it. So yeah, I think she's here to join the conversation, really.
Great, cheers for that. Actually, I don't know whether this has got a hand raise facility. I mean, I could randomly point to someone, or tell you what, if someone else wants to do a quick intro. James, Good hand raise.
Hi, everyone. It's really good to be here. So I'm James McLeod, Director of Community at Finos, which is the FinTech Open Source Foundation. Scott Logic are actually members of Finos, and Colin sits on the Finos board. And so that's how we know each other. My relationship with open source is, I would say it's probably more coming from an educational point of view. So I'm an engineer by qualification. So I've been involved in, leading engineering and development teams for a number of years now. I kind of came into the industry through consultancy. So I kind of took a telecommunications path in, but then started working for ITV and the BBC. And as financial services started getting into digital transformation, I kind of found the whole transformation of, financial services and, turning banks from siloed, often looked upon as legacy organizations into banks that are actually trying to innovate on the inside. And so with all of the various different meetups and, kind of communities I've been involved in, I thought that that would be a really interesting challenge. How do we actually educate people who have not collaborated or have actually been taught not to collaborate into being engineers who need to be able to collaborate in order to move forward? And so that got me kind of involved in teaching engineers how to work together, how to kind of recruit, new engineers into financial services from university. I organised hackathons and various other events, for Lloyds Banking Group when I was there. And then I transitioned into Finos, which is the FinTech Open Source Foundation, which is now part of the Linux Foundation. And so I'm kind of doing similar from within Finos across the Finos community. And so we have lots of different financial members, but also lots of engineers from different areas of engineering, both within banking and outside of banking. And I kind of get in the middle of all of it and see if I can help, kind of educate people how to do it and also give them a bit of steer on what they need to do as well. Cool. So that's me.
Cool. I think Lily, I spotted a hand raise. If you'd like to introduce yourself and speak a little bit about what open source means to you, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lily. I'm a final year student from the University of Bath. And last year I was an intern at IBM working for NetWest in Edinburgh. So Colin, I think that's where we actually met at and that really yeah, and I think that's why I actually started to have interest in this field. And at the moment, I'm applying to be a software engineer at a circular company that circularize all the materials they use in fashion. And if successful, hopefully, I'd be a software engineering trainee. So I'm still learning everything from start. And at the moment, I'm still trying to learn things from the scratch to see how I can participate in this community. And my relationship with sustainability is that I'm volunteering for a few roles, such as researching the symbiosis between nature and human well-being. And also I'm supporting a few regional donut economics community groups that are looking at how we can do biomimicry, as well as drawing the boundaries or using big data to draw the city portraits of how we're using our resources. So I have lots of interest in everything you just said.
Wow, yeah, there's some fantastic topics there. I'm sure we could get into also. That's a great introduction. Thanks, Lily. Anyone else want to introduce themselves before we launch into a bit more of a discussion?
Julia, I think. Julia?
Hello. Sure. Yeah, I am also an older software developer. I have been a free software contributor since the 90s, 98 specifically. So I'm here kind of in an unofficial capacity, but also officially, if that makes any sort of sense, because the company that I work for is also a free software company. I work for Wire, which produces a open source free software video conferencing solution. So I kind of grit my teeth every time I have to use a Zoom meeting. Outside of Wire, I am the developer of implicit CAD and of H-Slice and of GNU GIF. So I have a 3D modeling system where a 3D modeling system written in Haskell, a 3D printer driving system written in Haskell, and an image recognition application that is part of the GNU project that I maintain when I'm not at work. So I basically just work all the time.
I know that feeling. Thank you. That was a great introduction. Anyone else want to do a quick intro?
I think Emmanuel said something. I'm not sure. Hi, Emmanuel. Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Cool. Just as an aside.
Yeah. There
Okay.
you go.
I'm an Android developer from Kenya. Actually, basically Android is an open source code platform. And I think that makes a lot of difference for developers. Most of the times I use libraries which are open source.
Yep.
And yeah, I really support open source.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
If anyone else wants to introduce themselves, that'd be great, but also no pressure. If you just want to listen in, that's absolutely fine. So I'll just give a 30 seconds in case anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'll just do a quick introduction to myself.
Hey, Dale.
Yeah, so I'm Dale. Dale Murray. I work for a company called Sales Agility, and we're the authors of an open source project called Suite CRM, which is an open source CRM application, which you may or may not have heard of. So we obviously have quite a big community project around that, but as a business, we essentially have a completely free and open source product which we're trying to sustain and make money from. So
yeah,
obviously very interesting to hear everyone's thoughts on open source sustainability.
Cool.
I think Luke was next.
Hi, I'm Luke. I started developing open source in about 95 at uni. I was contributing to AROS, which is an operating system. I've pretty much worked on my own projects pretty much since then, and they're all fairly obscure.
There's nothing wrong with obscure. I have quite a few obscure projects, mostly for my own pleasure and benefit.
I mean, that's the most successful one.
Awesome.
Oh, lovely. I think Samantha's raised a hand.
Hi, can you hear me? I don't normally use Zoom, but I'm Sam. I'm from OpenSPL. I am not technically minded at all. In fact, Stuart, my boss, has just signed me up last night late. The reason I'm here, I'm particularly interested. I recently became the sustainability lead champion for OpenSPL. We do all things open source, but I want to kind of get involved in communities to learn more about what this means, because I think it's very exciting. I've learned in the last 3 years so much of what this means and the impact to people, communities, and the environment. And I just want to learn more from people like yourselves and try and take that to the communities I belong in, both locally in rugby and particularly in the education sector. So I'm going to learn a lot from you lot today, I hope.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think that's probably everyone, but apologies if you have been missed. As a next step, as I said, we'll get on to sustainability, but I'd like to take some small steps towards that first. And as a next step, I think I'd like to have a bit of a chat about what the open source community looks like. And from my perspective, similar to some of the other people that have introduced themselves, I've been working in open source on and off for about 20 or so years. And I think the shape of the community has changed considerably in that time. And I think it's important to understand the changes that have taken place and to understand what the community looks like now to better understand it. So again, rather than speaking myself, I'm going to pick on someone. So hopefully you're happy to speak about it. And also, there are a reasonable number of people here, but I don't think there are too many people for it to be an open discussion. So I'm going to ask people a few questions, but please do pick up the train of conversation. If you've got a question to ask, please throw it in. If you've got a point to make, please elaborate. So I'm going to start with Julia. You mentioned you've been a free software developer. And again, you're using slightly different terminology there. The terminology has changed since the 90s. What was the open source community like from your perspective, say 20 years ago? And how does the community now compare to that?
So about 20 years ago, I was part of the branch that broke off and created a was part of the Linux kernel team for a while. So I'm kind of there from the beginning, if that makes any sort of sense. And at that point in time, we were a lot more, it was a lot more of a social group. There were not as many businesses involved in the community itself. Like nowadays, well, at that point in time, if I wanted to like develop a device driver for a thing, then I would just develop it. I would hand it off to Alan, and Alan would probably fight with Linus about it, and eventually it might make it into the tree. Nowadays, we have, every portion of the kernel has a different kind of almost a corporate sponsor, if you will, somebody who has stood up to take care of that section. But that also means that, for instance, I've had problems lately getting changes into like the iSCSI layer or any of that sort of stuff, because my changes will start interrupting someone's corporate cycle.
Yep. And
they'll have to make some sort of a release into the field, and that's going to block them. So as a result, I've had some difficulties in that part of the world. So I've kind of gone off into the user space side of things. Obviously, Haskell became a thing here about 8 years ago or so. So functional programming is finally starting to come to fruition. I'm loving that. I have converted over completely to Haskell. So I have one C++ program that I maintain, but other than that, it's all Haskell stuff. So the community has gotten, while it has gotten larger, it almost feels, for lack of a better word, emptier, if that makes any sort of sense, because there isn't that kind of there isn't quite that kind of bond anymore between the different groups. You can't just reach out as easily to somebody else who is involved in it. And as you noted, obviously I'm from the free software side of the field, which is not just open source. It is a specific discipline thereof, which has been interesting recently.
Can you just, for the benefit of people that might not know the distinction, can you quickly explain the difference between open source and the free software movement?
Sure. The free software movement, from my perspective, is a little bit more to the left than the open source movement. For the free software movement, we have a short list of freedoms that we want to ensure that every individual has. And it's not just, the ability to look through the code, it's also the ability to, make it your own, publish it, reproduce it. There are 3 freedoms that Richard talks about that I can't tell off the top of my head, but it really just means to me that I use a very limited set of licenses instead of the more generic open source licenses. It's like everything of mine nowadays, both at work and personally, is all licensed under the AGPL, because that makes sure that everybody who has access to the thing has the ability to get the source code to the thing and has the ability to, set it up themselves and share it with the world. And, this is the, to me, a more radical position than just the open source position, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess some interesting points you made there, and that
quickly.
Oh yeah, go on. Sorry, Richard, I don't know if you can turn your microphone up a bit. You're a little bit quiet.
I can turn it down because I can turn it up if you want.
No big deal.
Speak louder. Why don't I just speak louder?
Go for it. Do it. Yes, we can.
I was just going to say, differently radical. So open source, in many ways, has achieved its aims. Stuff we set out to do 25 years ago, it's done. Free software has a long way to go. It was always going to be a longer journey. So it's a bit like at this stage, open source is mainstream, whereas free software is still radical. 25 years ago, they're both radical positions, to be honest.
They were.
Pays your money, you take your choice. It's just the journeys are different, longer timescales. One thing which people sometimes say is user freedoms versus developer freedoms. Different ways of thinking the same thing. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just reflecting on some of the things you've said, Julia, they certainly reflects my own experience. You mentioned at the beginning it was much more of a social group, whereas now there's a lot of corporate sponsorship, and it's become a corporate interest. There's a financial model behind a number of open source projects. Another interesting point you made was the community has got larger but emptier. And that's an interesting one. My experiences of early open source was sometimes it was hard to get your foot in the door, but once you found the community, it was very sticky. So there wasn't the central hub. GitHub didn't exist. I did open source through listservs and email groups, but once you were there, because it was quite hard to find the community, once you were there, you were quite tightly bonded to it. Now it's larger, but to your point about being emptier, I think that's because it's much easier these days to have a very fleeting relationship with a large number of projects than it is to have an enduring relationship with a single project.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Does anyone else on the call have, I guess, for the purposes of an introduction, sort of early stage experiences within open source? Does anyone else want to reflect on how they feel things have changed within open source?
Yeah, well, back in '95, it was pretty much all public domain. So you're working on buying disks from some distributor, and all the projects there, well, the projects then were just starting out, really. FreeBSD was pretty much just coming out, but was having issues with licenses. And Linux was pretty much just starting as well. But there was also other projects, and like I mentioned, AROS was one. That's the Amiga replacement operating system.
Oh, Amiga! I had an A500, fantastic machine.
Yeah, and Haiku, which was a BIOS, that was just starting out as well. So you had all these disparate groups, but the only companies that were really around were Cygnus, which is now Red Hat, and Red Hat, which was just starting out, in Debian. You had Slackware as well, but pretty much nobody used it. So it was quite disparate. But then literally all the software that you could get were all on Sun sites, which are all gone now.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Colin,
so
go on, James.
Sorry, I was going to say my relationship with open source was quite different, maybe 20 years ago. So when people were talking about the 90s and the early 2000s, I was actually a Microsoft developer, developing C++ and also using the .NET framework. And everything that I was doing was proprietary. So I was developing on the Windows operating system, using Visual Studio Code, using the .NET framework, and everything was licensed. And I remember, at that point, looking upon open source because it was kind of projected to be, a threat. And people kind of, asking the question, why would people need to use open source, when actually the .NET framework gives us everything that we need, And so I was actually kind of like on the opposite side, kind of looking in upon open source, thinking, why does this need to, actually happen? Why is this out there? Looking at Linux, thinking, why would anybody actually need to use Linux versus Windows? And so it was only really through my journey as a software engineer that I transitioned into open source, and so I had a bit of a awakening. So
yeah, I mean, open source is huge in the .NET world as well. Things like the de facto JSON parser is an open source project.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so Microsoft always wanted .NET to be observable, but people can actually contribute into it, which is slightly different.
Yeah, and I guess at Microsoft's journey into open source, again, that's a huge topic, and we know Microsoft as a company have changed considerably in recent times in terms of their approach to open source.
So
I'm not willing to talk on that subject at all.
But I remember being an early software engineer, having to take a bit of a leap of faith, into open source, and so it felt like a risky position, but it's definitely one that, I embraced, and, I've not looked back. The open source community is very rich and vibrant. Yep. And that kind of reflects on, how I see, engineering in banks actually kind of like transitioning into open source, people questioning the need to go to meetups and meet people outside of the bank, but when they actually do it, they, meet the community and they actually bring a lot more experience in from that. And it's really nice seeing other people's, you know, eyes open up to what open source brings, you know, versus being locked in. So yeah, I thought I'll bring that into the group. We're not all open source by, you know, introduction. Some of us have had to push our way in, or kind of, you know, find our way in.
Yeah. So I guess it's probably time that we started to address the bigger topic here. So we've heard a little bit about how open source has changed over the years. As I said, you know, I love that comment about the community getting larger, but emptier. I mean, there's no denying that the community itself now is really quite large, as very neatly illustrated by GitHub itself. And I mean, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I'm sure everyone here either uses projects from GitHub or contributes to projects on GitHub. So the community is huge. There are more developers than ever consuming open source code and contributing to open source code. So I'm probably going to ask maybe the wrong question. I started this discussion based on the premise that there is a sustainability issue within open source. That's an opinion of mine. I'm wondering if people share that opinion. So maybe raise your hands if you want to speak to that question directly. Do you think there's a sustainability issue in open source? And do you perhaps have any concrete examples you'd want to talk about in that area?
Yeah, there always
people. Yeah.
So go for it, Luke. Cheers.
There always has been, and it's always been financial. People seem to understand, well, don't seem to understand that it still costs money to make open source. So there needs to be money going into open source, no matter what.
Or people.
And you need to find. It's almost impossible to try and find a way to make money, or to at least make a living creating your own projects.
Can I jump in? I'd say you either need to sustain on the financial side or with loads of new people. So we've got lots of new faces now. So one of the ways I learned software was open source. So there's two elements to it. So can you hear me at all?
Yes, we can. No problem. It's a little quiet, but we can hear you.
Okay, I was just going to say the other thing is we've got loads of new people here, and you can either use finance or you can use new people. So those are two different elements of sustainability as far as I'm concerned. Especially when you go ahead.
Well, tell you what, I'm certainly not being ageist here. I know a number of the people on the call are relatively new to software engineering, and a question I'd have to some of the people that are quite new to the field: have you yourself ever considered contributing to open source, or do you have experience in contributing to open source? Again, either raise hands or please do just chip in. Oh, Ruth, hi.
Oh, don't know if we can hear you.
Give it a minute, Ruth. Are you able to communicate? If not, by all means, if anyone else wants to chip in, I know we've got a few people who haven't had a chance to participate again. So if you want to maybe relay some of your experiences, have you worked on some open source project, or maybe even considered working on open source project, but for whatever reason found barriers in your way?
I think personally, because I still don't have the capacity to actually contribute to something yet, but I'm actually quite looking forward to it. And it's not only just good practice or proof to your future employer to show that you're capable of something, but it's also a sense of community and something that you are bounded here to do something for a shared purpose. So I think that's personally, at least for me, that's the reason I'd be looking forward to participating in it.
You don't necessarily have to participate in somebody else's project. You can create your own. If you look at my GitHub that I posted, the majority, pretty much all the projects there that aren't forks are mine.
That's great. I'll look into it. Thank you.
Cool. That's a very good point, and this back to my earlier question around, what does the community look like? I think open source means something quite different to various different people. Luke, you've made a very good point about money being an obstacle, and that's a very valid point. However, I don't think it's I don't think it's the only obstacle, or I guess money is not the only reason that no, I'm not quite saying this right. Put it another way, I know a number of people who work within open source, and I'd include myself in that camp, where I quite deliberately separate the financial side of my life from the open source side of my life. I quite enjoy working on projects that I know people are using, but I don't have a financial commitment to that project. And as a result, I don't have any guilt in terms of how much time I do or do not spend on that project. So I collaborate quite a bit on WebAssembly. I'm helping to build a language called AssemblyScript, and I got offered to be paid in a cryptocurrency of all things. I was slightly tempted just because that intrigued me. However, I thought about it and thought, actually, I don't want to do that because that would change my personal relationship with that. I mean, obviously, I'm in a position of fortune where I've got a day job, which means that I can separate the two. But I think there are various different relationships people have with open source, and that's reflected in the way they participate. And Oded, you've got a hands raised, and apologies if I haven't pronounced your name correctly.
You said it right. So a quick introduction. Hi, I'm Oded. I recently joined Scott Logic as a software engineer. First of all, to Lily's comment, everyone can contribute to open source, even in small things like fixing typos in the documentation. That's contribution, and that's great. Like, you don't need to be a software engineer to actually do that. My small contribution was fixing very, very minor bugs in several projects, just because I used them and they didn't work the way I wanted to, so I might as well go fix them. I think that the title sustainability was a bit misleading, or I wasn't sure whether you're talking about something environmental, completely unrelated, or about maintenance of open source. Because everyone likes to create new projects, but to keep on maintaining, keep on fixing bugs, that's kind of a hassle that no one likes to do anywhere in any application. And especially when you don't have a corporate that backs you up and makes sure that this thing that provide revenues keep working properly, no one will care about that. Now, okay. I should make, sorry, one more thing.
Yeah.
I really admire Linus Torvalds, the inventor of Linux, and I always wonder how he made his fortune, because clearly Linux itself is free, but he makes his money from the other thing rather than the code itself, which I think is incredible. So we or organization can produce open source code, but make money from giving consultation on it, or other elements are surrounding the open source code, which I think is a wonderful thing, because it does give opportunity to everyone, every person who just started software engineering to contribute their little piece and join this big community. That's me.
One point I want to clarify, you make a very good point. When we talk about sustainability, it can mean different things. So I guess I'll tackle it head on by sharing my opinions on sustainability within open source. I do think that we are moving towards a position which is a little bit fragile, in that I've observed on a number of occasions some open source projects which have maybe one or two maintainers that have become critical parts of a company's infrastructure unbeknown to them. And more often than not, it's through some fairly convoluted nested dependency structure. And sometimes these things go wrong, and when they go wrong, they can go wrong really badly. Things like there was a left pad incident, a package that was only 11 lines of code that was removed from a package repository, caused so many things to break. There was FS Promise, there was Event Stream where someone put in a thing for stealing people's cryptocurrency wallets as a kind of software supply chain attack. For me, part of the sustainability issue is that I think a lot of the big corporates do not understand that they are highly dependent on a considerable number of open source projects that don't have themselves a sustainable ecosystem to keep them up to date and safe and secure. That's my own sort of personal perspective on sustainability in open source. I don't know if anyone wants to agree or violently disagree with any of those points.
I'll put my hand up to that, Colin. So I totally agree. So you can kind of split this into a couple of almost like points of accountability within, enterprises. There's the accountability of, the technicians and the engineering teams who need to understand their dependencies on open source, both, external to the organization, plus also their dependencies across teams inside the organization. But then there's also the wider business who may not have, technical roles, but they might be enablers for engineers to be able to get involved and contribute or even consume open source. And so there's two fronts that engineers and engineering leads need to take on. There's the technical front of understanding your technical landscape, which might come a lot more natural to, introverted engineers who like to be, eyes down on code and in their IDs and speaking with their teams. And then there's the kind of external extroverted side of engineering, which is selling open source and the reasons why, we need to be involved in that, and, the safety of open source and the efficiencies and the qualities and, the accelerators behind it, that you also need to be able to communicate to all of your wider stakeholders and other people in different types of business roles to remove the barriers for just being able to make a contribution, into an upstream repository. Or contributing something that is of use to you and your team, but could also be of use to other teams who do similar types of activity and might be solving, those problems for themselves, and duplicating effort. And so when it comes to sustainability, I often see the role of the engineer and the technician has also changed from being somebody, who was contributing in the 90s into, a smaller community, into being kind of like an engineer who also needs to be aware of the wider world around them and kind of represent open source in a way that people who would see it as a risk, need to understand that it's not a risk, but it's actually how the ecosystem of engineering and development has shifted, and how that actually relates to the wider technology and business industry.
Yeah, well, one of the things that frustrates me personally, and again, this is probably similar experiences to yourself, James, having both working in financial services, is a lot of large enterprises have acknowledged that this is a problem. You can see the headlines on, whether you read Hacker News or whatever else, you can see that there have been significant security issues or sustainability issues in projects. So someone put in things like Tomcat is maintained by one farmer in France.
They went through about a 3-month period where the only person doing any work was a farmer.
Yeah, and Tomcat,
when he had to go get his
Tomcat is
they're all going up and doing other things. It's like, well, we got things to do in our lives.
Tomcat is critical. Tomcat is critical to a lot of people. Yeah, however, a way a lot of large enterprises tackle that is that they pay someone else to try to make it safe for them. So they will pay money to companies who highlight security vulnerabilities. They will sanitize things. They will bring them into their own environment and keep their own copies rather than fixing the problem at source.
Yeah,
so people like Red Hat ended up hiring people to make sure they had people who could fix bugs, and that's one thing they did, which was not widely acknowledged and should have been.
Yeah, that's a good thing to do.
Worse, because the problem was the OpenSSL people who knew how to do it, if they went out for the weekend, hell, SSL, it's like the whole internet runs a day. It's like, oh yeah, we go for a drink, can't get anything fixed. So Red Hat had to hire people, but that's just one player. You can't rely on one company funding like the basis of all cybersecurity on the internet, because it's like, what happens if that one person happens to be on holiday? So there's a sustainability issue, because if it's only one company like Red Hat does all the maintenance, where are you at?
However, at least Red Hat are contributing towards the maintenance.
Yeah, well, they've taken it on essentially.
Yeah.
I think it's Red Hat, Amazon, Google at the moment. Maybe Microsoft. I don't know. I'm not after the injury. I was injured 10 years ago, so I'm no longer up to date. But I think a lot of the critical infrastructure is now being taken on by the majors, which is right. But the problem then is they're going to get their own players in. So they're not, yes, they hired lots of people who are clueful about community building, but there's now a disconnect. How do you get the new talent on board, which are not Google suitable? Not everybody can get through the Google process, not everybody can get the Amazon process, but a number of those are wonderful engineers which used to come through open source. Well, how are they going to get in now? How's Google going to get the people who can do the next generation of crypto security in? Because they're not going to go through the front door because the hiring process is too locked down now.
I must admit, that is almost another pet peeve of mine, and another topic altogether is that there are a lot of projects that are genuinely open source, and the emphasis on the word open, many people can contribute. However, there are quite a lot of open source projects typically run by very large corporates where they're open source in that the source code is on GitHub, but there's a distinct lack of openness in the way that they conduct themselves within the community.
Yeah, my company is probably guilty of that ourselves. I mean, honestly, we're running so fast that it is difficult for us to, to actually engage with the community at all. We, we tout the days that we get to contribute back to an upstream, and they're few and far between. Once every couple of weeks, we might get a patch into something. It's like we got one into Kubernetes, and we were thrilled because it was just the tiniest patch. But getting anything into Kubernetes through Google is just an amazing barrier nowadays, instead of an easy process.
And Google have locked out. They've got a very locked down hiring process now. It's not like it was 25 years ago or 20 years ago, where it just mattered the engineering talent. Now it's all locked down. So it's a double problem.
Not only that, but Google has, from my perspective, I was a maintainer on a project that essentially Google and ZenSource, between the two of them, they hired every engineer in the open source project, except for those of us who would not go to work for Google or ZenSource, and the project just immediately disappeared and died because all those engineers were at that point, basically no longer allowed to be contributing to the open source community in general. They effectively got bought. And, you can't blame them. Google and ZenSource had a lot of money to throw around. So the project died. That was the end of it.
Yep.
I should mention that it's still better than alternative. Even if the open source is just open to the public, but no one can actually contribute except for the company itself, it's open for transparency. And people can see that your code is safe and secure. And if we look at the comparison between Signal and Telegram, for example, one of them is open source, so people can reliably say that this chat application is secure, while the other, we don't know what's going on there, so it's automatically not secure. So even that small step of sharing your code is better than keeping it completely proprietary.
And that is actually one of the pros when it comes to banking and open source, especially now that a lot of banks are bringing engineering back into the banks themselves. And engineering leads within banks are accountable for the software that they're actually consuming within the banks. Knowing what's under the hood and being able to scrutinize, what you actually have within your systems is actually a very big driver towards open source in banking. And also the ability to remove the vendor lock-in as well. So RD, when you were speaking about Red Hat, kind of maintaining Linux on behalf of, such banks.
It was SSL, it was the TLS layer specifically.
Okay.
They would do some other odd stuff like that, but that also fell apart. They had that fracas. I didn't know why it happened like 5 years ago. I think probably the guy retired.
Yeah.
Whoever it was doing their SSL, the TLS layer maintenance. I think they must have retired or had a problem or got ill. And there was that phase where there was a huge ding dong, and I just didn't follow it because I have trouble typing now.
No, that's fine.
So active, but it just shows you've got a big reliance on a small number of people, whereas the banks are now finding that you can't do that if you've got fully auditable software. You've got to have enough people, you've got to have enough eyes.
So what I'm interested in, Colin, because we've been speaking about enterprise open source projects, where either, the barrier to entry is around the way that the project team is actually run, or the complexity of the project. Maybe some of these projects, it's not so easy to get involved because of the complexity of the projects. If we flip that around and say, okay, so how can, kind of the engineer who's new to open source, how can they get involved in projects? I mean, what is the actual logical entry point for a new person to actually get involved, so they're not put off by listening to enterprise, kind of issues?
I think one of the things that you have to do is you have to, and I've been through this experience myself, it is you have to better understand the community behind a particular open source project, because some are more welcoming than others. Some actually don't have an active interest in recruiting contributors, because there is an inherent overhead in servicing the contributions as they come in. So yeah, someone mentioned start by documentation and community. For me, it's the community. Start very, very small. I think someone mentioned, you can fix a typo in the documentation. That's really easy. If you do that and it gets merged relatively quickly, and someone takes the time to say, oh, cool, thank you. Okay, that's a good starting point. Then maybe take an incremental step up and contribute something bigger. Because again, from a maintainer perspective, it can be quite burdensome if someone comes along with a massive change that they want to contribute to your project. Because again, you've got to understand that it costs time and it costs attention from a maintainer to receive a contribution from someone else. So I think as a contributor, you have to almost earn the right in some respects for the attention of the maintainer to receive your contribution. So it's difficult. It's a challenge.
Do you think there's room in the world for tech sprints and other events that can get you involved in open source teams who are sponsoring that type of activity? So you kind of like at a person level, so you get
absolutely
to know.
Yeah, because it is quite literally entering into the community and learning about the community, and doing that through Github and through the vehicle of opening issues and pull requests. Yes, you can build relationships between issues and pull requests, but they're not the best way to build relationships. Some of the open source projects I work on have got Discord channels and Slack channels. They are a better way to learn about the community. Even better are the ones that have community group meetings. There'll be a fortnightly drop-in, and you get to meet the people. You get to understand people's motivations. It is very, if you genuinely want to be a significant contributor to any open source project, you've got to learn about that community and become part of it.
Yeah. Is there anybody in the group who's tried to contribute into open source or tried to get involved but has found it really difficult to do so, or is really struggling with that?
The AMD GPU project. There's virtually no comments, and it's all magic numbers.
NVIDIA does a slightly better job.
Has anyone ever used it maybe if you found anyone who's been a contributor, if you're hiring for a company, said, oh, well, I really like their work and their contributions, I would really like to get them on board in my company, and is that a way that, has that ever happened, and have you known anyone to have done that?
I'm quite strongly opposed to the general movement of GitHub being your CV, because I think Lily mentioned it earlier about being very keen about doing this, but you need time. And not everyone has that luxury of time. So I would prefer not to make that a significant part of any hiring process, because I think it's unfair to do so. That's my opinion on the subject.
Wow, I'm at 180 degrees on the other side of that. I will absolutely hire somebody who is contributing to a random project that is somewhere around, my worldview, and I have a short list of contributors I would love to hire right now. I am just waiting for them to need it.
I think maybe we're not at cross purposes, but not quite. I would not. I'm not saying I wouldn't look at what they've done in open source, but I wouldn't discriminate against someone who has no open source track record, because I think that is, in my mind, that's not necessarily a reflection of who they are as a person. It's more a reflection potentially of the time they have available to them.
Yep, that is absolutely the case.
Also confidence. It does take a lot of guts now. It wasn't like that 20 years ago. Who cared? Nobody's going to look at it.
Exactly. It's because it was smaller communities.
Yeah.
You were less exposed.
All you cared was your peers. And since we work with them all the time, that's it. Today, I'm pretty scared to put anything on GitHub, to be honest, because it's like, you're going to assess me about the stuff I worked on 20 years ago. And it's a bit like, well, yeah, I did that then. And it's like, I'm now doing small stuff. That's equally valid, right? That's where I'm in our life now. So I'm a bit like, I get a bit scared putting anything on GitHub anymore. It's a bit like, yeah, I'm not what I was. I had the injury. Yeah, all my mates are now like sea level and I'm just getting by, but that's okay. I do my stuff. But it is a bit of a, for me, I can see now why people, you need a lot of confidence. And 20 years ago, to be honest, I didn't really care. So now I've got a bit more.
Yeah, I think that might be another part of the problem that's occurring is that, there are those of us who have been doing this, 24/7 for 20 years. And as a result, it's hard for people to have the confidence to go, hey, you did this little thing wrong. Here's a patch for it. Here's a what have you. So we have kind of the field has gotten wider, but there are individuals who are so high up on the ladder that people think they can't start because they're just going to get trampled. And I don't know what to do about that.
I also am concerned about extremely toxic culture we've got now, because it's a bit like, really, life's too short for you to go and troll people on GitHub or whatever. It's like, get a life. Is it just me? I don't know, maybe I'm getting old.
I can't say that I've ever come across anyone. Yeah, I've not seen any trolling, but to Julia's point about people with a lot of experience. So I would actually say the network of open source contributors, it's actually relatively small. So you do come across the same people, kind of like at events or, just day to day, if you are a regular open source contributor. But I think it's also down to that smaller community to help, other people in as well and give people entry points and almost like pay it forward or kind of like, pay it back, invite contributions in, or, if people are doing things, as individuals, maybe invite other people to do it on their behalf and act like a mentor or a coach or, so try and find entry points to people. That's just my view anyway, because otherwise it does become unsustainable. If you can't kind of like coach the next, generation of contributors into those roles, then when people, leave those roles, then you've got nobody to fill those spots.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of jump in with, I apologize, I do have to finish on the hour. And one of the last questions I wanted to talk about was, I think we've all acknowledged the sustainability issue and how you fix it. My opinion is that a lot of the consumers need to take a greater responsibility in the sustainability of the open source community as a whole. And what I would like to see is companies that are building their profits and their future on open source, for them to take a closer look at the components of the open source software that they're relying on and have a look, see where they can find weaknesses, see where they are dependent on the farmer in France, for example, and actively help.
You don't know where to live. I mean, I knew where it lived, but it's not.
When you said farmer, do you mean pharmaceutical company or
no,
somebody with a pitchfork?
Somebody with cows and sheep and stuff.
Yeah, and sometimes that supports. Yeah. A proper farmer. So sometimes that can be financial if they are actively taking contributions, but a lot of projects are not taking financial contributions. And just like myself, for some of my projects, I don't want to take money for them. What I value is my personal attention. So if a company can come along and help with issue triage, if they can help with the documentation to allow me to do the thing that I enjoy the most, which is the creative side, for me, that is a very tangible difference that a consumer of a project can make. And by the way, none of my projects I would call critical infrastructure, but there are many projects that are quite critical that are maintained by single individuals. So that's my kind of up on a soapbox rant about how I feel sustainability can be achieved.
Are you explicit about that in your project README, Colin? Do you invite that type of contribution?
That's a very good point. No, I don't think I do. That is a fair point.
I had hoped by now, sort of however many years since Google Summer of Code, that you'd have actually got more contribution that time, because it's quite good getting an intern in, paid by somebody else to do a month of whatever you decide they want to do. So it might be a petrified stale email system, or it might be documentation, just whatever you feel like. I had hoped that my ecosystem might grow, but it seems to be just Google. There's a lot of talent out there which isn't getting in front of people. Like, I mean, Google were doing it to recruit people. It was a sheer recruitment tactic. But I had hoped that that you'd have got more aware companies, especially since they're desperate for development talent, that actually they could have got together, looked at their key infrastructure and said, actually, why don't we give 3 months from somebody who's not paid very much, who's getting in, they got some talent, and do something interesting. And I'd hoped it had blossomed, and it just hasn't. But these things happen.
Yeah,
you can't.
There is direct evidence to suggest that people, when they're evaluating whether they think they want to work for a company, do evaluate that company's relationship with open source. They take a look on GitHub. Does that company open source some of their own code? If I work at that company, will they allow me to make positive contributions back to the community? It matters to the people that they should be looking to hire.
It also gave the problem with hiring developers is you really can't assess somebody in half an hour. You need weeks or months. So there's an element where you're not getting the right talent in, and everybody says that, but it's not just the interview process. It's just not possible.
Yep.
Why not just do more go summer code for the companies? Get an intern in to work on an open source project. We can look at what they've done. And if they're brilliant, you've got to get out way in. There's plenty of recruiters, which I'm sure would work for a cut. So it's the whole. It's just how do you make that grow? And I don't have enough physicality anymore to do that. So
cool.
Up to somebody else. All I can do is show around in this.
Apologies, I'm afraid I'm going to have to shoot off. It was wonderful meeting you and thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I don't know whether our hosts are happy to just keep this room open if people want to continue the conversation. Sadly, I will no longer be part of it, but thanks again. I was really happy to hear from so many of you, lots of fantastic opinions, and I learned a lot. So thank you
so
very
much, Colin.
Everyone.
It was really interesting.
Cheers,
Thank you.
No problem.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you later.